Dear participants, we will begin shortly. I would like to remind you to turn on your camera and keep your microphone muted. Thank you. Good morning and welcome to the 11th Center for International Law Studies, or CILS Conference. CILS Conference is an annually held thematic conference on international law. After 2 years of hiatus due to the pandemic, this year, the 11th CILS Conference will be held with online platform. This event has continued to serve as a platform to bring together ideas in promoting and developing international law to respond to the growing needs of having strong guiding principle in a borderless world. This year, we're carrying the grand theme of global resilience, recovery, and solidarity, the role for international law. My name is Alia Zafira, and I will be your master of ceremony for today's event. This year, the organizer continued to bring the discussion of international law in Indonesia to a larger global audience. The 11th CILS Conference will be held by the Faculty of Law Universitas Indonesia in cooperation with the Faculty of Law Universitas Sumatera Utara. Before we start this event, let's hear the national anthem of Indonesia, Indonesia Raya. To honor the national anthem, please turn on your camera while the song is being played. To begin our agenda, we'll have Associate Professor Dr. Edmond Makarim, SCOM, SH, LLM, as the Dean Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia, to deliver an opening speech on behalf of the Rector of Universitas Indonesia. To Dr. Edmond Makarim, SCOM, SH, LLM, I welcome you now to speak.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, selamat pagi, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. The Honorable, the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Universitas Sumatera Utara, Dr. Mahmud Siregar, SIMHUM, H.A. Amri Jinangkung, Director General for Legal Affairs and International Treaties, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Indonesia, Chairman of the Center for International Law Studies, Hadi Rahmat Purnama. First of all, allow me on behalf of the Chancellor, my Rectorate, to represent him in this event. Due to the other duties, he apologized for not being able to attend this event. Distinguished speakers and participants, ladies and gentlemen, fellow speakers, and good morning to our audience joining us online from around the world. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to welcome you to Universitas Indonesia and Universitas Sumatera Utara as our co-hosts. I am pleased to see legal professionals from all areas of the profession here today, including scholars, lawyers, and government officials, those who work for universities, research centers, law firms, and those who work for the government. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed humanity to a very different vision of human futures. A vast array of human life has been altered with legal implications following the pandemic like never before. Around the same time period, we also witnessed international crisis in Europe that is on conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And now we rivalry between China and the US, which caused the disruption in the global supply chain of technology products. This conference strives to highlight the divergent problems and issues relating to the various facets of international law related to the impact caused by international crisis. Therefore, in the wake of such looming crisis, the Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia, together with the Faculty of Law, Universitas Sumatera Utara, Indonesia, are holding today international conference with the theme Global Resilience, Recovery, and Solidarity, the role for international law. This is the 11th years that we are holding our major annual event, particularly at the Faculty of Law Universitas Indonesia, the renowned public university in the western part of Indonesia, where the development of international law is also well treated by their respected international law experts. Entering its 11th year anniversary of the conference. The conference has become one of the most important avenues for international law discussion and debates, particularly for the Indonesian context and broader Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific region. The conference has continued to serve as a forum of international law stakeholders in Indonesia and beyond to bring together ideas in promoting and developing international law to respond to the growing needs of having strong guiding principles in a borderless world. This year, the organizers continue to bring the discussion of international law in Indonesia to a larger global audience. In total, there are more than 40 accepted papers presentation, whom the authors are from universities and institutions from Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. It is the rapid development in this area of the law that makes conferences such as this one so valuable. This conference focuses on several very interesting and challenging topics, such as interaction between international law and national law, international law and economic recovery, digital international law, maritime law, new trends in private international law, cross-border dispute settlement, global health architecture. In a world which borders are no barrier to investment and where through contagions, performance of investment in some parts of the world will inevitably affect share market and investors in other parts of the world. It is crucial that legal practitioners and academics keep abreast of international law developments, not only in Indonesia, but also overseas. I would like to thank the speakers today for giving up their time in order to assist the legal provisions to perform its duty of continuing legal education. I would also like to thank the organizers of this conference for the work they put into bringing legal professionals together to discuss this important and dynamic area of law. This conference is held by the Faculty of Law Universitas Indonesia in cooperation with the Faculty of Law Universitas Sumatera Utara, Indonesia. The synergy between the interests of those two faculties is clear. We all have an interest in ensuring that our members are provided with up-to-date legal developments. We also have an interest in our members spending time together in an educative environment, such as the cross-pollination of ideas that occurs as conferences, such as this what makes our profession cohesive despite its diversity. I trust that the discussion that will take place during this conference will contribute to this objective, and I would like to thank all the speakers who have agreed to make presentations. I hope you enjoy the intellectually stimulating days ahead. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Associate Professor Dr. Edmond Makarim, Ascom SHLLM, for the opening remarks. Moving forward, I would like to invite Associate Professor Dr. Mahmud Siregar, SHM Hum, as the Dean Faculty of Law, Universitas Sumatera Utara, to deliver an opening speech. To Dr. Mahmud Siregar, SHM Hum, I welcome you now to speak.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Good morning. The Honorable Dean of Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia, Dr. Edmond Makarim, Chair of the Center for International Law Studies, Bapak Adi Rahmat Purnama, distinguished speaker, all participants, ladies and gentlemen. 2.5 years ago, it seemed impossible to think that hard times would end. It felt impossible to see the light in the end of the tunnel. However, with the spirit that is in line with the topic of this conference, resilience, recovery, and solidarity, we can all get back up and move forward toward the future. The pandemic has tested the effectiveness of the global leadership to drive responses to rapid escalation of emergency situation. It has also highlighted the need to strengthen international legal framework. The world has changed. The experience has provided us valuable lessons, but new challenges will continue to emerge. Honorable participants, thank you to each and every one of you for participating in the 11th Center for International Law Studies Conference. It is an honor for the Faculty of Law, Universitas Sumatera Utara, to be able to co-host this conference alongside the Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia. Through this conference, we would like to engage with all of you in open and constructive session on international law issues. We believe this event will be able to bring together academic, student, practitioners, as well as public and private institutions, both in national and the global sphere, to share and put forward ideas on international law, especially post-pandemic. I would also like to express my sincere appreciation to the Dean, Vice Deans, and Center for International Law Studies of Universitas Indonesia Faculty of Law, as well all organizing committees who have been working very hard to make this event come together to become a success. I'm very confident the conference will bring the best for all organizers and all participants. I hope it will also strengthen the framework for future collaboration and academic events. We look forward to a fruitful academic discourse. May we all have a successful conference. Billahi taufiq walhidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning.
Thank you, Associate Professor Dr. Mahmud Siregar, SHM Hum, for the opening remarks. Moving forward, I would like to invite Mr. Hadi Rahmat Purnama, SHLLM, as the Chairperson of the Center for International Law Studies, Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia, to deliver an opening speech. To Mr. Hadi Rahmat Purnama, SHLLM, I welcome you now to speak.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. Salam kebajikan. It's been an honor for me to open this conference on the 11th conference of Center for International Law Studies. Honorable Dean Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia, Associate Professor Dr. Edmond Makarim, Dean Faculty of Law, Universitas Sumatera Utara, Associate Professor Dr. Mahmud Siregar, distinguished professor, speakers, colleagues, and all participants, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and pleasure for me to welcome you to the 11th Center for International Law Studies Conference 2022 on the theme of global resilience, recovery, and solidarity, the role for international law. This conference is a part of 98 commemorations of legal educations in Indonesia. And I would like to thank Center for International Law Studies, Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia, Faculty of Law, Universitas Sumatera Utara, for their tremendous effort to provide as a host and also support the organizing committee, as well as Joko Sutono Research Center, who put all things together so we can have this conference. This conference is based on our experience. Today, we have witnessed the crisis and over a crisis in the recent years. We have COVID-19 pandemic, we have Myanmar junta military, we have Ukraine and Russia armed conflicts, and we might face the global financial crisis. So international community, as a part of the ongoing process in order to prone to the multidimensional crisis. Therefore, we have to have international solidarity, which is as important for us to face all the challenges and obstacles for the futures of all mankind. To capture what we have challenges, therefore we have this conference. This conference will have in today's sessions. So the first sessions, we will have international law and economic recovery. It will address how the international law could facilitate and maintain global economic stability. On the second days, we will bring the issues of international law and solidarity amidst global insecurity. The discussions will underline the importance of global cooperations to overcome the social problems that community faces during the global crisis. I'm aware that the topics are highlighted even very much important for our common global futures. I hope that this event will bring the spirit of collaborations among scholars, practitioners, policymakers, and the youth, because future challenges will require more collaborations rather than competitions. Lastly, I hope that this event will create networks and friendships that will pass all the partitions that we have, especially during these times. I wish you all have productive and fruitful discussions in the next 2 days. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Mr. Hadi Rahmat Purnama, SHLLM, for the opening remarks. Before I officially close today's opening ceremony, I'd like to invite everyone for a photo session, so please make sure all cameras are on. Please be ready in 3, 2, 1. One more time. 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 3, 2, 1. And last. 3, 2, 1. Moving on, we are pleased to welcome our moderator today, Dr. Detania Sukarja, for moderating at first plenary session, the International Law and Economic Recovery. Now, it is my greatest pleasure to introduce our moderator today. Dr. Detania Sukarja is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law, Universitas Sumatera Utara. Her research focuses on economic law, business organization, and investment law, among others. She earned her doctoral degree from Universitas Indonesia and Master of Law from Georgetown University in the United States. Along with moderator, we are pleased to welcome our notable speakers. First, Mr. Fitra Faisal Hastiadi, PhD, from Faculty of Economics, Universitas Indonesia. Second, Professor Hikmanto Juwana, PhD from Universitas Indonesia. Third, Mrs. Amanda Besar, LLM, from Legal Advisor for Co-Sherpa G20 Indonesia. And last, Professor Andrew Mitchell, PhD, from Monash University. Before we continue, I would like to invite Dr. Detania Sukarja as the moderator to guide the first plenary session. To Dr. Detania Sukarja, I welcome you now to speak.
Thank you, Alia. Assalamualaikum. Good morning, everyone. I'm Detania Sukarja from Universitas Sumatera Utara, and I will be your moderator for the first plenary session of our conference. As we have heard from the opening remarks from both the deans of the Faculty of Law of Universitas Indonesia and Universitas Sumatera Utara, the pandemic has evidently disrupted life across all countries and communities globally, and it has also negatively affected the global economic growth. The IMF even stated that 2020 was a year like no other, with the COVID-19 pandemic producing the most significant recession since the Great Depression. The pandemic has also tested the global leadership in effectively driving responses to unprecedented escalation of emergency situation. International economic organizations were also forced to test their instruments and policies to address disasters, especially those dealing with health emergencies to cope with the ongoing economic and financial crisis. As the countries globally are still trying to recover from the recession, however, at the same time, we are facing new and emerging global economic uncertainty. So therefore, today we have here with us 4 distinguished speakers who will share with us and elaborate further on relevant issues regarding the interplay between international law and economic recovery. Our first speaker is Mr. Fitra Faisal Hastiadi, PhD. I will be reading a short CV of Dr. Hastiadi. So Fitra Faisal Hastiadi, PhD, is currently a full-time researcher and lecturer at Universitas Indonesia at the Department of Economics. He obtained his BA in Economics from Universitas Indonesia. During his BA, he worked as the teaching assistant at Universitas Indonesia for the same department before he then continued his study to Keio University, Japan, where he got his master's degree. He then earned his PhD degree program from Waseda University, Japan. Dr. Hastiadi has published a number of articles for reputable journals and working papers. He has shared a significant contribution for ASEAN 2030 study while he was working as a research associate at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo back in 2011. He also served as a national researcher at the National Economic Council, where he gives advices for the president of Indonesia from 2012 to 2013. And the title of Dr. Hastiadi's presentation today is Indonesian Economy, Navigating the Danger Zone. The next speaker is Professor Hikmahanto Juwana, PhD. Professor Hikmahanto Juwana, as we all know, is a professor of international law at the Faculty of Law Universitas Indonesia. He's also currently serving as director of Universitas Jenderal Ahmad Yani. He obtained his Bachelor of Law degree from the Faculty of Law Universitas Indonesia, his Masters of International Law from the Faculty of Law, Keio University, and his doctorate degree from the Faculty of Law, University of Nottingham, United Kingdom. He teaches in a number of law courses at several other leading universities in Indonesia, and also a visiting professor at several global universities, like the University of Melbourne and US, Nagoya University, and others. He has published a number of books, articles, and research papers on various aspects of international law, business law, and space law. He also consults for both private and governmental sectors. And he also, Professor Hikmahanto Juwana will also be delivering a presentation on international law and global economic recovery. And then our third speaker is Professor Andrew Mitchell. Andrew Mitchell is who is the Associate Dean of Research and Professor at the Faculty of Law, Monash University, Melbourne. He's also a member of the indicative list of panelists to hear WTO disputes. He obtained his law degree from Melbourne, Harvard, and Cambridge, and is also a barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Victoria. He has previously practiced law with private law firm and also consults for states, international organizations, and the private sector. Professor Mitchell has published over 150 academic books and journal articles. His presentation for today is entitled TRIPS Waiver, Path to Economic Recovery. And then last but not least, our final speaker is Ms. Amanda Sayasa Besar, LLM, who will be presenting on behalf of Dr. Edi Priyo Pambudi. Ms. Amanda Sayasa Besar is currently the legal advisor for Co-Sherpa G20 Indonesia. She earns her Bachelor of Law degree from Universitas Indonesia and her LLM from Harvard Law School. And she's also going to deliver the topic on G20 and the global economic recovery. I would like to officially welcome our 4 distinguished speakers for today, and hopefully we can all have a fruitful discussion. So we will start our discussion with Dr. Hastiadi. Each presenters will be given 15 to up to 20 minutes, and the presentations will then be followed by discussions and Q&A session in the end. But for Dr. Hastiadi, unfortunately, because he has to fulfill another commitment, his Q&A sessions will follow immediately after his presentation for around 10 minutes. And then after that, we will move on to the presentation of the next speakers. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Fitra Faisal Hastiadi.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Chairwoman. Thank you, Dean of the Faculty of Law, and also all the participants, the distinguished speakers, my Dai Senpai, Prof. Hikmahanto, we went from the same school, K University. So yeah, my title today is about how to navigate or to becoming far away from the potential crisis. So let me share my screen over here. Okay. Yeah. Can you see it?
Yes, we
Okay.
can see it.
So the motivation of today's session, today's theme is about how to navigate away from the danger zone. So if you recall, Top Gun, so in the very initial session, the opening scene, you actually heard a very popular song during the 80s, actually the Danger Zone, right? So this is actually how we are actually to become the maverick of the Indonesian economy, how we actually move away from the danger zone. As you might already recall, in 2021, we already bid farewell to the recession or crisis at that time. So in 2020, as you already recall, we had a very negative growth, minus 5.3% in second quarter. And we have also another following quarter, the third quarter, minus 3.49%. And in the fourth quarter of 2020, minus 2.17%. All in all, we had a minus growth, minus 2.07%, if I'm not mistaken, during 2020. But in 2021, so we had a very good growth. Actually, we are moving far away from the recession. So the pandemic itself is becoming the major obstacles during this the first 2 years, 2020 and 2021. But in 2022, we had several occasions and several unprecedented events, one of which is coming from the geopolitical tensions. What we are actually facing today was actually the one that I discussed earlier with the Minister of Trade during 2020. At that time, I was the spokesperson of the Minister of Trade, and I talked to the minister at that time, Pa Agus Parmanto, and I told him that we are going to have some issues in the next following years during the pandemic or the recovery period. So the fiscal stimulus coming from the big boys, the US, EU, Japan, and also China, is actually becoming a major push for the economy, of course. But to the other sense, it's also becoming another source of potential issue or possibly crisis if we are not careful. One of which is because the stimulus itself is pushing the demand away, which is good. We have the demand overshooting condition. But to the other perspective, to the other side, the supply condition is actually quite constrained. Why? Because during the pandemic, it's actually quite lagging behind. So it cannot catch up the dynamic demand condition. So in that way, I told the minister at that time, we were going to have very high volatility in commodity prices. That is one thing. And the second one is maybe, and the most possibly that most of the country will actually try to make some quotas in their export. For example, Thailand, we import some rice and also several other things, but Thailand, Vietnam, and some other countries will actually try to prioritize their domestic economy rather to entertain the global economy. So in that sense, we are going to have a supply shortage, and not to mention that the demand overshooting that creates the high price volatility. So that created disproportional growth. And in the first 2 years, it's actually becoming a very common sense that the pandemic itself is becoming the major source of volatility. But coming in the 2022, while the pandemic is now becoming more to an endemic situation, now we are going to have another condition that is actually coming from the geopolitical tension that treat the overall tension in the economy from the demand and also the supply side. So the price hike and so on and so forth is becoming our major threat nowadays. The overall contributions coming from the variance of the composition, the variance of the composition is actually telling us that the contribution to the overall shock to the economy is coming. One is from the pandemic, and second one is from the inflation. And the first pandemic is now becoming more and more endemic, but the second factor is now becoming more established and becoming an existential issue nowadays in the economy. So so it has a very actually contractionary contribution to the overall economy itself. So we need to be aware of the potential disruptions coming from the inflation. So this is the data that I got from the social media. So we have this AI-based sentiment analysis. So we gathered maybe around 22 million of data points, but we need to actually to eliminate 30% of which, because it's actually coming from the buzzer. So the algorithm is actually eliminating the buzzer, and we only have 15 to 16 million of data points. But all in all, it's actually quite robust that the negative sentiment for the overall economy is actually quite detrending, so decreasing over time. Although if I actually put September onward here, maybe we have some potential spike in the data. So some of the keywords or the popular buzzwords coming from the overall sentiment analysis. So it's about poverty, investment, businesses, industry, unemployment, crisis, bankruptcy, trade, import and export, unemployment, and also fiscal stimulus. So, but the one actually the most concerning one is actually here, poverty. So the sentiment analysis is now becoming an early indicator or early warning system of what actually the magnitude of the economy in the future is most possible to become. But all in all, actually, in terms of the forecasting until the end of the year, we are still fine because the foundation of the economy is still okay, and it's quite probable that we have more than 5% growth within this year. Another thing happened during September. So we had the price hike in Pertalite and also Pertamax. This is actually how the government is doing the fiscal consolidation, because it's actually to prioritize the one that is the most needed. So this is actually the curve, the Lorentz curve, that is actually telling you the proportion of who actually getting the subsidy. It's actually quite equal. So in which that, in that sense, is not okay, because everyone is getting the energy subsidy. So the one that is actually need to be put more focus on is actually the bottom 20%, not the rest of the income level. So it's actually waste of money and waste of national budget if actually we are actually just burning the money to give the one that is actually not in the priority mode. So in that sense, we need actually to reprioritize the subsidy, given the possible external shock from the geopolitical tension. The geopolitical tension is the one that we cannot control. The one that we can control is the data of poverty, data of the household by name and by address. We can actually try to actually optimize the data over time. It's actually quite actually in hand if you compare it with the dynamic geopolitical tension, which is actually quite out of control. But of course, the central bank and also the government is also trying to tame the potential inflationary spike coming from the subsidy. Okay. Okay. So our simulation suggests that there is an additional income for bottom 20% compared to the rise in price. So we had a proxy of NTP, nilai tukar petani indeks harga dibayarkan, is becoming a proxy of how the farmers, especially we put farmers as a proxy because most of the farmers are actually in the bottom 20%. They're actually facing a 5.4% of hike, yeah, in the products that they're trying to buy. But at the same time, the subsidy, the cash transfer is adding 7.5% of income for this bottom 20%. In that sense, it's actually creating a buffer for the bottom 20% itself. Although we need also to actually take care of the supply side, not only from the demand side. Okay. Now, the central bank is also trying to intervene by raising interest rates several times. In August, 25 basis point, in September, 50 basis points, and last meeting we had another 50 basis points of increase in BE 7 days repo rate. Of course, this will actually constrain the economy, but the transmission mechanism is just like this. BI Bank Indonesia is trying to tame the inflation, which is actually the major shock, the major contribution for the overall shock to the economy, meaning that if BI is taming the inflation, especially coming from the expected inflation, so the overall growth prospect will be actually quite positive. So it's actually quite a positive intervention coming from BI, taming the expected inflation coming from the demand side. But yeah, of course, this is actually what will be happening in the future if BI is not doing intervention in terms of the rate hike. But of course, the inflation is coming from two sides, the demand side and also the supply side. From the supply condition, the producer's price index nowadays is now becoming far away. The gap is becoming bigger and bigger with the consumer price index. So in that sense, the government need also to take care of this producer's perspective, because according to Gauss-Markov simulation, this is telling us that in the third and the fourth quarter this year, the producers will actually will pass through the inflationary burden, from the producer side to the consumer side. This will actually increase the potential inflation in the future. So in that sense, while the government is reprioritizing the budget for the one that is needed most, it should be coming not only to the demand side, but also from to the supply side, meaning that the government need to give subsidy or incentives to the electricity bills, to wage bills that now the producers are actually trying to take care of, because nowadays they are actually just wait and see, because the demand condition is not that optimal yet. But what they are doing now is they're still selling at the same price, but with less kilograms, meaning that we are actually facing a shrinkflation instead of inflation nowadays. But the condition will be much worse if the government cannot actually to incentivize the producers to at least stop or minimize the pass-through effect from the supply side. Of course, if we compare it with other countries, we are quite okay, fundamentally speaking. So we're expanding, in terms of industrial expansion, we are expanding. Last September, the purchasing manager index in manufacturing is just one of the highest since the last 5 months or so, and this becoming the top 5 performer in the world, so which is actually quite okay. Although the government need also to stay the momentum, actually to push and to maintain the momentum while actually giving this extra subsidy to the producers so that the industry can expand more. If you compare with the economic growth, we are actually above average, above world average, and we have also the inflationary updates last month, year on year, is about 5.9%, which is actually quite okay. Is within the consensus from the economists. Yeah, although we were having the price surge coming from the energy, but it's actually within the consensus. So we are quite okay in that sense. And the exchange rate condition is just, although we are now facing that the rupiah is continue to take extra pressure from the strong dollars, but the strong dollar is not unique for Indonesia, but it's actually also giving some negative externalities to other part of the countries. Steve Hanke and also some billionaires in the US is telling that what Jerome Powell is doing by raising the Fed is actually the Fed rate is actually self-inflicting recession and self-inflicting crisis. Why? Because they're trying to tame their domestic inflation, but at the expense of others, because it is actually creating the bandwagon effect throughout the world. Every central bank nowadays is trying to actually increase the interest rate. If you see it from the overall commodity process, we're actually facing a detrending movement coming from the systemic demand destruction. So this will be actually primarily caused by what the Fed is currently doing. Like Jeffrey Sachs in 2011, from his book, The Price of Civilization, the crisis is not natural. The crisis is always man-made. So in that
5 more minutes, Dr. Hastiadi.
Yes, in that sense, the Fed or the overall policy measures should be actually compatible with the potential recovery momentum. Okay, so what about the possible recession? We are not that in actually in a very high possible or risk in getting recession. Yes, just 3% or less maybe, because our macroeconomic condition is actually quite good. So coming from the trade surplus, it's actually now the last trade surplus is the 29th surplus, respectively from 2020. So it's actually quite good in that sense. But we need also to push in several other sectors to always navigate away from the burdensome tension in the future, especially in 2023. Okay, thank you for listening, and that's actually all my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Hastiadi. Very interesting that Dr. Hastiadi has emphasized that with regard to recession, Indonesia is pretty much at a stable macroeconomic situation. And then in the presentation, Dr. Hastiadi has also highlighted how we need to anticipate a disruption that might emerge from the current inflation. And then in the beginning, it's also interesting that Dr. Hastiadi also mentioned about the disproportional growth between supply and demand. But overall, with regard to the top of the town at the moment, with regard to recession, we should not worry too much. That's probably the main point that I got for your presentation. So as I've mentioned before, that Dr. Hastiadi has to fulfill another commitment. So we are going straight into a discussion and Q&A session for the next 10 minutes. If any of you would like to raise a question, you might ask directly by raising your hand, and I will provide you the opportunity, or you can also write in the chat room. and I will read the question for you. So, so we have a question, one hand raised from Mr. Hadi Purnama. Please, Pak Hadi.
Yes, thank you very much, Rita, and thank you very much, Pak Fitra. It's very quite interesting presentations and data. It's a little bit confusing for me from low background, but it's quite a lot of graphic and numbers. But anyway, you mentioned today that we have quite a lot of crisis, economic crisis. As I remember, in 1997-98, we have Asian financial crisis, and then we also have U.S. crisis in 2009, and then somehow we also facing another crisis in the coming year. And then in looking at the system of economy in the world, do you think there is a problem with the system of economic today? And then as we see that the competitions between state, it's become a very outrageous, is if I may say it, especially in terms of trade between the state, especially if we know during the Trump administration in the US, they have this trade war between the US and China. So do you think the economic systems that apply today, it's still one of the best choices for us to live as a international community? That's my first questions. And my second questions is about the one of your presentation that's took my intentions very quite exciting, is when I see most of these currency is in the negative appreciations, but I saw that ruble have very positive appreciations, but the positions of the Russia itself is now in the world, in the war, if I may say it, or in the armed conflict with Ukraine. And I saw that the appreciations of ruble is better than the rest of the appreciations of currency in the world. So I would like to have explanations from you for that point. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we can actually trace back from the U.S. presidential inaugural speech in 1961. John F. Kennedy, ask not what your country can give for you, but ask what you can give for your country. That is in 1961. But in 1981, there's another inaugural speech. 20 years after the 1961 inaugural speech, we had Reagan. Don't try to find the solution from the government, because the government is the problem. That is actually the totem of Reaganomics, trade and economic liberalization. What had happened after 1981? So the rich is getting richer. Why? Because Reaganomics is trying to say, what Reaganomics is trying to say is actually, okay, you can get rich, but you don't need to pay tax as long as you can contribute to the economy. So this one specific occasion is becoming a systemic risk throughout the world. Yeah, why? I can actually quote in 2011, Jeffrey Sachs in his book, Price of Civilization. Yeah, the price of civilization, if you are getting rich, you need to contribute more. How? To give your tax, to give your money to the people. But yeah, this is not going, this is not happening. The equality becoming more unequal, and then we are actually facing very disastrous economic conditions. The US itself cannot actually give the social health care to the community. Why? Because they don't have enough money okay, they have the money, always have the money, because they can also run extra deficit to the budget, and everyone is actually consuming dollars, but to the expense of the overall world, the overall world and global conditions. So that is actually the problem. In order actually to stay sustainable, yeah, the crisis is most possibly is man-made. It's actually not natural. It's always man-made. So in that sense, the rich need to pay tax. The rich need to contribute more to actually sustain the economy even more in the future. So that is actually the answer. And then to your second question about the strong dollar, again, this is also self-inflicting, right? So what happened before in 2021, there's a major stimulus, the Biden consensus stimulus, yeah, going to the economy, and this create an inflationary shock. Powell and Yellen at the first time, they're telling everyone that this is only transitory, the inflation is okay. And then coming to the second term, how about the inflation? It's okay. But in 2022, it's not okay. It's not transitory, but it's runaway inflation. So the Fed is trying to make up their false decision previously by actually doing extra contractionary monetary policy at the expense of the whole world. So this is self-inflicting. So if you want to stop the crisis, you need to ask the Fed not to be aggressively putting the world at stake. So that is actually the possible answer.
Thank you very much.
Did that answer your question, Pak Hadi? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much to Pak Hadi and also Dr. Hastiadi for the response. Is there any other questions from the participants? You can ask directly, or you can also write your questions on in the chat room. So
I think it is enough, because I need to go right away.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
Sorry, but I will actually answer the question via chat later on. Yeah. So just give me the questions and I will answer.
Okay. So there's one from Pak Rizky Banyualam.
Okay.
It is inferred in your presentation that government support in supply side is also needed to overcome the demand of shooting. However, there are WTO disciplines which allow subsidies or government support to be countervailed.
Yeah,
Also,
it is actually subject to countervailing measures, but if you are actually paying for the electricity bills, there's no actually WTO against. There's no rule actually against the WTO because everyone is actually doing it. So in terms of giving the subsidy, of course, there always a possible stake at WTO in terms of countervailing. But yeah, I think it's a matter of who you are actually sending. Yeah, if it is actually top lawyer, so I think it's okay. But nowadays we are actually lagging behind in every dispute and settlement in WTO. Why? Because we are not that good at sending the lawyers, because we don't have the money. So you from the Faculty of Law need actually to do something about it to actually to give ground for the overall discussion within the WTO.
Yeah, so Dr. Hastiadi, one quick one before before we end your presentation. So you mentioned that because from the subsidy, from the energy, the fuel energy discourse, that the middle class is the one that has to suffer the hardest price shocks, and we need another fiscal push. What would be your proposal in order to deal with it? Because even I personally identify myself as middle class, right? So what would be your idea on this issue?
So we need to intervene subject to the layers of income. The bottom 20% is subject to cash transfer, of course, but for the rest of us here, which is actually the middle class, we don't need cash transfers. What do we need? The economy is rolling, right? So in that sense, we need actually the industry is rolling. So the subsidy needs to actually coming to that way in that perspective, so that we are not actually subject to another price shocks coming to the pass-through effect from the industry. Because now the producers is now trying to what do you say, to sustain the price, the initial price, but now they are actually quite struggling because the cost of production is keep increasing. So how we actually stop or to minimize the possible pass-through effect from the producer side to consumer side? The government, need to actually intervene from the fiscal perspective.
Okay. Dr. Hasjadi, thank you very much for your time for
Sure.
today. We appreciate that you you can make time for the conference,
Sure.
even though
Always
that
a
you
pleasure.
really have a really tight schedule. Thank you. Stay healthy, and hopefully we can collaborate again in the future events.
Okay. See you again, all. Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right, everyone. That wraps up the presentation and Q&A with our first speaker, and therefore we will move forward to our next presentation. Then from the next speaker, Professor Hikmahanto Juwana, PhD. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Professor Hikmahanto. The floor is yours, sir.
All right, thank you very much, Neta. A very good morning to you all, and I hope that you are healthy. And it is an honor for me to be invited at this CILS conference, the 11th CILS conference, which I also have something to do with the Center of International Law Studies Conference, since it is triggered by faculty members from Universitas Indonesia. All right, I've been asked to discuss an issue of international law and economic recovery. Now, I must apologize that I have not prepared my PowerPoint. Hopefully, what I'm going to present is not going to be powerless and pointless. In any case, I will try to see how to connect between international law and economic recovery in current situation. All right, let me start by saying that economic crisis, is not something new that is faced by the world. Of course, crisis has been happening in the past, and the world have coped with the challenges. Now, what about economic crisis? As far as I remember, after the World War II, of course, we are experiencing economic crisis. Prior to that, the United States is facing an economic crisis. There is a stagflation, and also other parts of the world. And it is worsened by the war in those times. Now, as we understand from the experience that the United Nations was established, replacing the League of Nations, and also there is a discussion by leaders of, at that time, the Allied forces, those who wins the war, the Second World War, and they gather at Bretton Woods Conference. They gather there to discuss a very challenging issues, which is how to cope with the crisis, especially the economic crisis. From the history, we understand that at a time, the World Bank was established, the International Monetary Fund was also established, and also at that time, there is a vision that international trade is very important to have the economic growth around the world. So my understanding is economic cooperation was the only way to achieve both peace and prosperity. And also free trade not only promoted international prosperity, but also international peace. Now, we you understand that currently we are probably not the same situation as in World War II, but we are facing with health crisis because of the pandemic. And also we have a war which impacted on the food supply chains throughout the world, especially the third world countries. So we're going to have another crisis, which is food crisis. And what we will see soon, if war will not be stopped, is we're going to see an economic crisis. So this is where I see that economic recovery is very important. And also the summit meeting of G20 in Bali next month is crucially important. We understand that, well, of course, many countries are still suffering from the economic shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. We understand that tourism is going to recover, but it has not come back like previously. Also, the airline industry, various industry, and war in Ukraine make it worse. That's why people were saying that recovery has been deeply uneven between the rich and the poor countries. And what worries our President Jokowi, when he visited Germany to meet with the leaders of G7 and also to Ukraine and Russia, that the one who's going to suffer badly is the third world countries, because the supply chain of foods is disrupted with the war. We understand that this year, G20, Indonesia's team for economic recovery will focus on 3 sectors. Probably my colleague Amanda Besar can explain this more, which is healthcare, digital-based transformation, and transition to sustainable energy. And of course, Indonesia is trying to make a more just world order. Recently, in Indonesia, we have managed to have our vaccines, and hopefully that these vaccines will be distributed not only among Indonesian people, but also people around the world, especially the third world countries. And this is very important. This is to show that Indonesia believes in multilateralism. Indonesia believes in working together. That's why we take the theme of in G20, recover together and recover stronger. So the togetherness is an important part of the multilateralism. Next, the question is, can international law play a role amidst competition among states? We know that the US and China have been involved in trade wars, and also amidst the war in Ukraine, where there are those countries who sided with Ukraine. There are those, of course, you have Russia, and there are countries who are sided with Russia. And also there are countries like Indonesia, which we don't side anyone, but we believe that war needs to be stopped for the purpose of humanity. War needs to be stopped to save the third world countries from famine. The war needs to be stopped so that the economic growth can be recovered. So Indonesia, as you may all understand, we have a policy of free and active policy, meaning that we will not side it with anyone, but we will side it with humanitarian issues. We are sided with peace, and we are active in doing so. So the G20 is an opportunity, not only for Indonesia, but for the world. Why I said the world? Because if you have a meeting in the UN, for example, at the Security Council, Russia have a veto power, China have a veto power, whilst the US, UK, and France have a veto power. Recently, we know that any resolution from the Security Council by the US condemning Russia will be vetoed by Russia. And the same goes, if the US or its allies will condemn China for their aggressiveness in Taiwan, in the Sea of Taiwan, then it will be vetoed by China. So this is not something that is in occurrence in 1940s, because the 5 members who have veto power, even though they may have different ideologies at the time after the Cold War, during the Cold War, still they can work together, right? They will try to balance the power. But now, it seems that they may not want to work together. For example, when Nancy Pelosi was going to Taiwan, and of course the People's Republic of China disliked that incident, and the president of China went to meet with Russian President Putin, to show or to give message to the US that, look, if you going to play around, then I'm going to also play around, and this is not good for the world. So this is the challenge, I think, that has to be faced by the world. And again, I must say that Bali is a good opportunity. Why Bali is a good opportunity? Because those who are involved in the war in Ukraine or post-COVID, they will come to Bali, and then hopefully not only that they will address the agenda that has been provided beforehand, but also the Indonesian government can facilitate those leaders who may have involvement in the Ukraine war to sit down and to discuss, issues. Even though it's not in a very detailed manner, still we need them to be at the same table and then discuss the issue in the hope that, there's going to be some solution to stop the war. And this is
5 more minutes, Professor.
All right. So this is very important. Unless you stop the war, there's not going to be any economic recovery. So this is where a situation is different from if you compare to Bretton Woods, where at that time those who win the war is establishing the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, and even the ITO at the time, and then preceded by the WTO. So this is the challenge. This is the challenge for the world, so that they can have a certain solution. Now, the G20 summit meeting in November will become a test for the world, and also a test for history. For example, will all head of states and governments attend the meeting? This is very important, because if there are some head of states or governments will not attend the meeting, and how can you possibly sit down and discuss the very important issues facing the world? Secondly, will there be a chance for the head of states and governments who are involved in Ukraine to sit and discuss solutions? Will there be any joint statement by all members of the G20? Can the joint statement transform into legal commitments under international law? So this is where international law will come into play. Well, in essence, can summit meeting of G20 in Bali of 2022 becomes the quote-unquote the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. So this is a challenge, and I hope everyone can play a part, including the United Nations, in making sure that all head of states, all head of governments will come to Bali, and then they will discuss the important issues facing the world. With that, I thank you, and I hope that this gives you some idea for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hikmahanto Juwana. I would like to highlight a few important points from the presentation. First, that history has shown that we could cope with crisis, and economic cooperation is the way to achieve peace and prosperity. And Professor Hikmahanto also highlighted how the economic recovery, the ongoing economic recovery at the moment has been unequal, and the third world country suffers the most due to the disruption of food supply chain, and therefore it is also very important to see the strategic importance of the upcoming G20 meeting, which Professor Hikmahanto see as quote unquote the new Bretton Woods effort, to find possible solutions, to see it as an opportunity to promote peace, economic growth, and it will also test the commitment of global leaders to peace, to reach peace, and finding efforts to provide the threats that we are all facing globally at the moment. I hope that can wrap it up, Professor. And therefore, we're going straight into the next speakers, and hopefully Professor Hikmahanto can wait until we finish with the with the final speakers, and then we will jump into a discussion and a Q&A session at the end, Professor. Thank you very much. And now we're off to the next speaker. I would like to welcome Professor Andrew Mitchell of Monash University, who will be presenting on TRIPS waiver, path to economic recovery. Professor Andrew Mitchell, the floor is yours, sir.
Selamat pagi. I'd like to begin by thanking the organisers for the invitation to speak today. And so my presentation today is on TRIPS waivers, a path to economic recovery. Now, I've got COVID at the moment, so please excuse me if there's any coughing during my presentation. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, no, yeah, that one. So in my presentation today, first I'm going to talk about what a TRIPS waiver is and why it might foster economic recovery. Then I'm going to talk about how might a TRIPS waiver help break down intellectual property barriers to vaccination. Thirdly, what is the nature of the recently adopted TRIPS waiver? And then finally, how a TRIPS waiver might be implemented as a matter of law. So if we go to the next slide, please. So what is a TRIPS waiver? Well, TRIPS is an international legal agreement between all members of the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. And it requires WTO members to provide copyright rights, patents, trademarks, confidential information laws, etc., for their people. And currently, the intellectual property of vaccine companies, pharmaceutical companies, is very heavily protected. Now, this has led to many countries, for example, India and South Africa, and a large number of NGOs, over 150 of them, as well as protesters, to call for a TRIPS waiver, which would allow governments to temporarily waive or suspend these intellectual property rights. If we go to the next slide, please. Now, compelling arguments have been made both ways regarding TRIPS waivers. And this article that was published in The Economist newspaper on the 20th of April 2021 is one that argues for a TRIPS waiver. If we go to the next slide, this article, which was also published in The Economist newspaper on the same day, argues against it. And what I'm going to do now is just to provide a brief summary of some of the arguments for and against, or the pros and cons of a TRIPS waiver. If we go to the next slide, please. I'll start with the pros, or the arguments in favour of a waiver. So the argument is that a waiver could help address global vaccine inequality. So certain areas of the world, for example, Africa, have particularly low vaccination rates. And this is partly because vaccines, particularly mRNA vaccines, for example, the Pfizer vaccine, can be very hard to transport. Sometimes they require storage at minus 80 degrees centigrade. There have also been general exceptions for intellectual property that have been introduced in the past, for example, for penicillin production during World War II. Another argument in favour of the waiver is that it promotes cooperation rather than competition. The argument is that it allows us to more efficiently leverage our global scientific and technological capabilities. Another argument is that vaccine companies have a duty to repay the public money which has been given to them. So, for example, the development of the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine was estimated as having been 97% publicly funded. Now, there are also arguments against the waiver as well. One is that it removes the financial incentive to innovate. One of the reasons why the COVID-19 vaccine was developed so quickly was due to the vast financial rewards that labs, drug companies, universities, and foundations, as well as investors, had. An intellectual property waiver is going to disincentivize them and rational investors from developing treatment when we encounter future pandemics. It's also been argued, excuse me, that an mRNA platform technology has bioweapon potential, and therefore an intellectual property waiver could empower nations that have ill intentions. Also, not all vaccine companies have received public money. For example, Pfizer. If we go to the next slide, please. In any case, the topic for today is economic recovery. And there's a strong case to be made that a TRIPS waiver would foster economic recovery. We've already seen the devastating effects of COVID-19 on local and world economies. Lockdowns have forced many businesses to insolvency. A McKinsey study found that consumer spending collapsed the first wave of the pandemic, swept across countries in early 2020. And we've seen huge volatility in markets as well. So this graph of an Australian exchange traded fund, which contains 1,500 holdings across 20 different countries, including the US, Japan, and the UK. Arguably, the faster we can get the world vaccinated, the faster the economy is going to recover to a stable, prosperous state. COVID-19 and all of its contagious resistant variants have also proved that they quite easily move across borders. As such, it's in the economic interests of all countries to try to solve vaccine inequality and achieve global vaccination. If we go to the next slide, please. So with that in mind, today I want to try to explore how a TRIPS waiver might help break down IP barriers to vaccination, the nature of the recently adopted TRIPS waiver, and how the waiver might be implemented as a matter of international and municipal law. We go to the next slide, please. The intellectual property barriers to vaccination can be broken down into 4 types: patents, copyright and industrial designs, confidential information, and clinical trial data. Next slide, please. Firms wanting to manufacture developed vaccines can sometimes encounter barriers to production, where the vaccine and its production processes are protected by patents under the domestic law of the country where the firm seeks to exploit the invention. Equally, patent rights can prevent the importation of finished vaccines or production inputs where this occurs without the patent holder's authorization. If we go to the next slide, please. So copyright and industrial designs are less relevant for vaccines per se, but they can still cover things like written material on product information documents, product labeling and inserts, and software and data compilations. Industrial design protection also covers things like tests, ventilators, and PPE. We go to the next slide, please. Now, there's certain information and know-how which might be central to the production of any vaccine. While a lot of the required information might be in the public domain, some specialist knowledge is more likely to be protected as confidential in the context of newer technology platforms, such as mRNA vaccines. Vaccines technology are best understood as a package of various inputs, comprising both patented inventions and/or know-how, and some of this might be confidential. Obviously, confidential information is very hard to get out of people. We'll go to the next slide, please. Now, to get vaccines approved in a member state, regulatory authorities also require clinical trial data. This data can also include sensitive information regarding the manufacturing process, the formulation, dosage, delivery method, indicated usage, and general safety information. These regulatory procedures are distinct from the protection of intellectual property as such, and many countries do not maintain entirely independent approval processes that call for the submission of data. One thing which might help is that some countries base their approval processes on whether other countries have approved the same vaccine. We go to the next slide, please. I'll now provide a brief history of the TRIPS waiver and then describe the waiver in its current form. Next slide. At this point, it's important to know that an IP waiver mechanism already existed many years before COVID-19 in the form of the Doha Declaration and Article 31 bis of TRIPS. However, recent discussions during COVID time have focused on expanding that mechanism in some ways. The proposal in 2020 for a more potent TRIPS waiver contained 3 components. The first is the suspension of obligations to provide IP rights as such, at least at a certain minimum standard. The second is the suspension of the obligation to provide for the effective enforceability of covered IP rights, including through the availability of civil and criminal remedies and the enforcement of rights at the border. And the third is a peace clause or agreement precluding members from enforcing and seeking compliance with TRIPS obligations through the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. India and South Africa had petitioned the WTO for the waiver. Europe, Britain, and Japan, amongst others, had opposed the move. Now, the US was under heavy pressure to support it, but it somewhat resisted this pressure. Now, the resulting ministerial decision is therefore somewhat of a compromise. The decision, which was adopted at MC12, so the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, is the current TRIPS waiver. We go to the next slide, please. The decision's main operative provision is paragraph 3B. Paragraph 3B allows members to derogate from TRIPS Article 31F, which is the domestic market requirement, in exceptional circumstances. Members can do this through legislation, through executive or administrative orders, and so on. Now, previously, members could only override IP rights if doing so was predominantly to supply its domestic market. It could also allow products manufactured to be exported to eligible members, including through certain international or regional joint initiatives, which aim to ensure the equitable vaccine distribution. Now, all of this is now waived. What is considered adequate remuneration for holders of intellectual property rights can now be taken into account, as the humanitarian and non-profit purposes of specific vaccine distribution programs and existing good practices in instances of national emergencies, pandemics, or similar circumstances. Next slide, please. There are, however, some important limitations to the TRIPS waiver. The first concerns confidential information. So a waiver is not going to alleviate challenges surrounding the forced disclosure of confidential information. Moreover, a waiver is not in itself going to dispense with regulatory requirements or procurement procedures. By way of example, Bolivia made an agreement, with a Canadian firm for the supply of vaccines. However, an obstacle that arose was the need for the Canadian authorities to establish that the vaccines produced would be safe and effective. If the Canadian authorities hadn't yet ascertained that the firm could produce vaccines that met regulatory standards, then a waiver is not going to help. So just suspending IP rights doesn't get rid of regulatory obstacles. If we go to the next slide, please. Nevertheless, a TRIPS waiver is going to be useful in the context of patents, as well as in copyrights and industrial designs. As such, I'm now going to turn to how a TRIPS waiver might work as a matter of law. Next slide, please. So the TRIPS itself is in what we call self-executing. Even if we have a TRIPS waiver, that decision needs to be implemented. Now, one way in which a waiver of TRIPS provisions might operate is through the suspension of multilateral dispute resolution mechanism in respect of particular COVID-19 related measures taken at the domestic level. This would mean that members give up their rights to instigate dispute procedures against another WTO member. Critically, this would not require formal legal change at the domestic level. Alternatively, we could also suspend domestic enforcement action, and that can mean removing remedies such as injunctive relief or setting a cap on available compensation. And the third option is a temporary suspension of IP legislation itself rather than the remedies. Now, each of these options can be fraught with questions. Go to the next slide, please. And I've divided these questions into four smaller parts. Constitutional questions, whether a TRIPS waiver will conflict with the member's broader international obligations, and how the VCLT is likely to resolve issues that arise from the TRIPS waiver, and finally, whether a TRIPS waiver would be treated as an estoppel in international law. Going to the next slide, please. So removing or modifying enforcement rights or remedies, the unremunerated use of IP subject matter or test data, or the forced disclosure of confidential information, these could all constitute takings of property. Indeed, national constitutions often demand that compensation is provided. In my research with Torman and Samlidis, we suggest that perhaps this would turn on whether the Constitution uses language of acquisition or requisition. For instance, the High Court of Australia has said that when the government prevented cigarette companies from displaying their branding on their cigarette packaging, this wasn't an acquisition of property because the government didn't acquire any property as a result. In countries, however, that use language of requisition, the Constitution may be more likely to cover IP rights and demand just compensation. Next slide, please. Second, a member that adopts a TRIPS waiver might still have an obligations which conflict with the waiver, say because of multilateral conventions. We go to the next slide, please. Now, the WTO Dispute Settlement Body, or DSB, has previously provided as a remedy authorization for members to derogate from their TRIPS obligations. So the waiver would seem to prevail there. This happened, for instance, in Ecuador and EC bananas. Next slide, please. Similar issues of conflict or inconsistency arise for bilateral or regional trade agreements. In theory, members may be confronted with claims that there have been breaches of such separate trade agreements. However, the chances of actual disputes being brought are quite slim, particularly in the context of a temporary measure to address the pandemic. This is especially so given the very low rate of dispute settlement under these sorts of agreements so far. We go to the next slide, please. Under bilateral investment treaties, investors can also bring proceedings against member states. Now, note that these would be directed towards the domestic measures taken to implement the TRIPS waiver, rather than the TRIPS waiver itself. However, the MC12 decision is unlikely to allow investors to argue that their legitimate expectations have been breached. This is because even before the MC12 decision, it was already possible for member states to expropriate IP rights in some circumstances. So it's not as if investors could say, well, we didn't know that this was a possibility. Also, given the distinctive character of a TRIPS waiver as a temporary measure at a time of global health crisis, it might be unlikely that cases would actually be pursued by investors. Moreover, certain bilateral investment treaty provisions do carve out obligations in situations of national emergency. Now, if we go to the next slide, please. Now, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, or VCLT, might offer us some tools to resolve some of these conflict issues. Next slide, please. And here are some of the relevant provisions. The analysis for this is quite in-depth and technical, and is beyond the time constraints of this presentation. But if you're interested, I'd advise you to read on the next slide. It'll be published in the article in 2023 in volume 33 of the Fordham Intellectual Property, Media and Entertainment Law Journal. And it's already published on SSRN and ResearchGate. In short, however, the key question is, how do we classify a WTO waiver which is made pursuant to Article 9.3 of the Marrakesh Agreement, but is not incorporated into a WTO agreement as a formal amendment? Again, we provide our analysis in the journal article. Next slide, please. Finally, I turn to whether a TRIPS waiver could operate as an estoppel. Next slide. Could an estoppel be invoked on the basis that a WTO waiver founded a representation that a PTA or a bid dispute resolution proceedings would not be brought? Now, this would be invoked by a member in a forum using principles of international customary law. Now, as the question of detrimental reliance would very much depend on the circumstances of the case, my focus today is exclusively on whether a waiver could reasonably constitute a representation for estoppel purposes. Next slide, please. And there are two potential arguments for no, that a waiver could not be framed as an estoppel. First, a decision of the ministerial conference doesn't constitute a representation made by a member, or that an instrument in the form of a TRIPS waiver is not a representation. Now, I think the first argument is probably weak. It disregards the fact that ministerial decisions are multilateral. Ministerial decisions stand authoritatively for the decisions and representations of constituent members. The second argument maybe has more hope. It turns on whether a representation can be implied and whether the adoption of an instrument like the MC12 decision can constitute an implied representation. Next slide, please. In the legal status of Eastern Greenland case, the PCIJ accepted Norway's entry into several bilateral and multilateral international agreements that described Greenland as part of Denmark, constituted reaffirmation by Norway of Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland. And this was enough to operate as an estoppel. In Argentina Poultry, the WTO panel found that Brazil's previous acceptance of arbitral awards, however, did not mean that Brazil had consented not to bring a dispute before the WTO. The panel said estoppel can only result from the express or in exceptional cases implied consent of the complaining parties. Now, the PCIJ's successor, the ICJ, has taken a restrictive definition to representation. In the Land and Maritime Boundaries case, the ICJ said estoppel would only arise if acts or declarations a state consistently makes it fully clear that it will take a course of action. Likewise, in the North Sea continental shelf case, the ICJ said that a very definite, very consistent course of conduct is needed. Therefore, it's unlikely that a waiver could operate as an estoppel, especially as a WTO waiver is meant to provide members with a defence against only certain claims, but not all claims. Even if we accept the TRIPS waiver is a representation, members would still be vulnerable in non-WTO fora. Next slide, please. So to summarise, today we've looked at why a WTO TRIPS waiver will help economic recovery. And we've explored the current TRIPS waiver and how that might overcome certain IP barriers. And finally, we've considered how the waiver might be implemented internationally and domestically and the legal implications of this. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Right on time, Professor Andrew Mitchell. Thank you very much. Precisely a little bit over 20 minutes, but I would like to thank you for your strength, delivering the presentation in your current condition. And you also has helped me to wrap the discussion. Professor Andrew Mitchell in his presentation has highlighted the pros and cons of the TRIPS waiver and how it can also foster economic recovery, and also the presentation also highlights the proposals, the ideas in how to implement it. Thank you, Professor, and we will be going into discussion and Q&A session later after we're done with the final speaker. And that's why we're moving on to the last speaker of the day. I would like to welcome Ms. Amanda Sayasa Besar LLM, who will be presenting on behalf of Dr. Edi Priyopambudi. Welcome, Ms. Amanda Besar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will just share my screen. Okay, I think, can I just check if that's okay? Is it all good? Okay. Good morning, everyone, the distinguished panelists. It is an honor for me to speak here today on behalf of the esteemed Dr. Edi Priyopambudi, the co-Sherpa of the G20. He would like me to also pass on a message to everyone here today. Firstly, to thank the committee for the invitation, and our hope that the G20, especially the Indonesian presidency, will continue to have your support as we near the summit. Now, with so many crises at hand, we will need all hands on deck, and this conference is an important part of that roster of resources that we hope to draw upon. And as we're in the middle of drafting and negotiating the outcome document right now, the topics discussed by the distinguished speakers today have been very informative to that end. Now, without further ado, allow me to begin my presentation. I will elaborate on these 3 points. First, the Indonesian economic condition. Second, the momentum for economic transformation. And lastly, the Indonesian presidency's innovation for an action-oriented G20. Now, I'm glad to say that the first speaker actually mentioned a lot about these indicators in much greater detail, but let me just summarize what we have in our ministry, at least, that we've noticed that based on these economic indicators, Indonesia has been resilient in spite of the ongoing storm and is on track for a strong recovery. Now, the economic growth is at 5.44% and has exceeded the pre-pandemic levels, and it's marked by a strong international trade performance. Our trade balance continues to record surpluses, and it's the highest in the last decade. And moreover, we have now become part of the upper middle income countries. Now, the fact that Indonesia has been able to maintain its financial stability must not be taken for granted. The crises continue to affect us to this day. Professor Hikmahanto mentioned many of them earlier, and most likely in the foreseeable future as well. We have not fully returned to the pre-pandemic condition, but now we must handle the impacts of the extreme conditions of climate change and geopolitical conflicts. In order to meet our economic growth target in 2023 of 5%, we must remain optimistic in the lessons we have learned so far. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us many things. Most of all, the ability to anticipate and respond quickly to crises. We have noted some lessons learned from a McKinsey report. First, that while government policy is important, individual behavior is just as important. There must be a willingness on the side of the public to cooperate with the policies. Second, that economic stimulus programs must put the public health element at the forefront during these times, as keeping our community healthy leads to better implementation of economic recovery programs. Our National Economic Recovery Program follows this principle and focuses on initiatives that aid in case detection, therapeutics, vaccines, and public health measures like contact tracing. In addition to that, we've also expanded social assistance programs and supported business activities with more targeted funding. And to do this, trust is the most critical component. Furthermore, the pandemic has ushered in a new era of digital transformation. Having said that, it is a double-edged sword, as it may widen the existing gaps between those with access to technology and those who do not, aka the digital divide. Now, unemployment can become a side effect to digital transformation. Our goal is that technology be used as a tool that serves a purpose to support the development of people, not become the purpose in and of itself at the cost of the people. Moreover, as we see in the news every day, different parts of the world are experiencing the very real effects of climate change, among others, heat waves, floods, and droughts. Now, to mitigate these effects, we must transform our energy infrastructure into one which corresponds to the need for concerted efforts worldwide, but should also be conscious of the fact that many countries are at different stages. Now, one of Indonesia's main strategies, as you can see here in the slide, is to leverage our nickel reserves to promote electric vehicle use. We've also focused on sustainability initiatives and established the Indonesian Environment Fund Agency. It promotes fundings for projects that are intended to protect and conserve the environment. Ultimately, Indonesia hopes to achieve a successful economic transformation by empowering its human resource. We will be entering the demographic bonus golden era, and to maximize this potential, the government has instated several things. First is a large budget allocation for education, which we are channeling through scholarships, school operational funds, and various other programs. We've also increased the budget for MSME financing, and we've had put special attention on reskilling and upskilling programs through the pre-employment card program, the establishment of thousands of employment training centers, and the implementation of super tax deduction policies for vocational education. Now, distinguished panelists and participants, with the current crises that we have yet to fully recover from in mind, this is where the G20 comes in. It is a premier economic forum comprising more than 80% of the world GDP and 2/3 of the world population. It was initiated to resolve urgent global crises, and there's never been a more important time than now for the G20 to set a policy agenda which will launch concrete actions for global recovery. Hence the theme that we have chosen for this year of recover together, recover stronger. As you can see in the slide, the framework of the presidency that we have set consists of 3 pillars. The first is global health architecture, the second, digital transformation, and the third is energy transition. As a note, an additional fourth pillar, food security, has been added informally to reflect the recent situation. And we've also identified the key outcomes that we hope to achieve in each pillar and the cross-cutting issues that we must deal with across the different working groups. The pinnacle of this would be the creation of a comprehensive exit strategy for global recovery. As we can see here, there are many cross-cutting sectors such as the digital economy, strengthening MSMEs, empowerment of women, youth. We want to be more inclusive. We have energy transition that will provide access to technology and financing, etc. Now, the action plan that we have set into place, as you can see in this slide, is that these three main agendas would feed into the finance track and Sherpa track priority agendas. And we have the synergy between the finance and Sherpa track. Now, finance track is for the finance minister and the central bank. And then the Sherpa track is shared between the coordinating minister of economic affairs and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The primary outcome, of course, is the exit strategy for recovery. And the objective is that we would hope to have a declaration that would contain a comprehensive action plan to accomplish this theme of recover together, recover stronger. The way that the G20 has been set out is that it is going to all pool into the final summit, starting from the working group meetings. And then there's also the ministerial level meetings for each working group. And there's 12 working groups. And we also have engagement groups, which are the civil society. And there's 10 engagement groups, such as the B20, C20, and T20, which is the think tanks. Now, the G20 summit will be held in November, and we hope to have a declaration between the leaders that will bring collective real actions and tangible outcomes. Having said that, we are currently at the stage of drafting these documents. Perhaps if you have been following the news about the G20, so far the results of the G20 have been chair summary, and allow me to provide a distinction between them in which we require consensus of all of the G20 members in order to have a declaration. The key message, I think, that currently has been provided by the G20 so far is that there is consensus on the substantive issues. So all of the things, for example, in agriculture and health, in the Empower and the Women Initiative, there is a consensus in how we want to bring the solutions. Having said that, there is a very real geopolitical situation that we're dealing with, and that is going to be the biggest challenge that we will have to overcome in order to have a successful meeting in November. Having said that, whatever the outcome, I believe that there is also this additional layer that the Indonesian presidency has come up with, which are the concrete deliverables. Now, this is a new innovation of the Indonesian presidency, where we pool the multilateral and bilateral projects of all of the G20 members that address some key points in all of the main agendas. To date, there are 71 projects on health, 9 on digital transformation, and 23 on energy transitions that has already been selected by our team. The hope is that through these concrete deliverables, we are able to have real outcomes after the commitments have been made that would be able to be implemented throughout the multilaterally and bilaterally, as well as with public and private partnerships. Now, to discuss a little bit about the main agenda outcomes of the 3 pillars, the first is global health architecture, where the outcome is to accelerate global recovery by ensuring that the global health system is resilient in providing pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. Now, one of the key achievements of the G20 so far is the FIF, the Financial Intermediary Fund, that is explicitly made for this purpose of ensuring resilient global health system resilience for PPR. Second of all, there's also the promoting interconnectivity. This is to speak of the way that vaccine certifications are done across different countries. And so we need to standardize these vaccination certifications, and also having equitable supply chain for creating vaccines and producing distribution of vaccines. Now, the second is digital transformation. Digital transformation speaks to restore the post-pandemic global economic order to make it stronger, more inclusive and collaborative, leveraging digitalization to create economic value through these technologies. And we focused also on creating lifelong learning, and also to be able to keep the rights of employees, of workers, as well as creating these innovations that would be helpful towards digitalization. The third is energy transition, where it is to strengthen the global sustainable energy systems and just transitions by increasing accessibility of energy, of clean technologies, and focusing on energy transition financing, all of which must be cognizant of the fact that we cannot do this transition of energy without being aware of the effects on climate change and the climate change commitments of each of the governments. All of these, as I've mentioned before, are to ultimately create partnership projects between governments, between businesses, and government to businesses. Now, this is going to be the impact that we hope the G20 will have on economic recovery. As has been mentioned before, as has been mentioned before, currently we are facing geopolitical tensions. This means that maintaining dialogue is particularly difficult. I think that every G20 member has already come up to us to say that this is something very challenging even for any of them. And we hope that as a country that is usually not allied to a particular bloc, that we can provide this avenue for informal dialogue to concentrate on resolving the impacts of the global crises that are seriously affecting millions of people around the world. Because even if we cannot immediately resolve the issue of the war, but there are very real impacts of the war that we need to address now, and we cannot wait until the war is over for us to deal with this, because as the war is ongoing, there is also famine, there is a lot of infrastructures that have been broken down. We need to start the recovery now. And so this is the message that we have been sending to the delegates. I think that based on the progress of the negotiations so far, they also have similar motivations in mind. And so the second point of action-oriented concrete deliverables, this is, I think, one of the middle grounds that we are hoping that at least the delegates can be able to get behind this, even though on the same table we have Russia, we have the G7 on the same table, but everyone agrees on having these concrete deliverables that we can provide for the people after the G20 is over. And previously, perhaps this is not, previously G20 declarations have been quite elaborative, wordy, it's been very technical. This year, we hope to reflect the action-oriented language into the declaration and keep it succinct to strengthen the message to the public that the G20 is going to take meaningful action to assuage their concerns. And this brings me to the final point, which is that we hope that the G20 this year will be able to set the path for future policies As you may be aware of, the G20 is not a forum that creates legally binding obligations. But the political commitments that are made in this forum are also important because, for example, we're going to be facing the COP27 soon. The G20 and COP27 commitments must be in sync. We cannot backtrack, but we should try to make our commitments stronger. Now, the presidency this year has had to navigate very, very uncharted waters. Having said that, we hope that these commitments that the countries make, along with the concrete deliverables, will be able to provide people with the solutions, or at the very least, set into motion the negotiation process. I think it will be very interesting and to see how November will come around. We are really urging everyone, academia, the government, the people, to take part in making sure that the G20 presidency this year will be able to successfully pull off this conference, even with all of these challenges that I've just explained to you earlier. Because I think we do need these, media coverage, articles being written on these subjects, just because it will help to push the leaders to set aside these differences that we have. And I'm not trying to undermine the very serious repercussions that should be gotten for violations of international law. But there are people that are suffering here that we need to focus on, and we hope that the G20 this year will be able to provide this reassurance for them. And I think that concludes my my speech. Thank you so much for the opportunity here today.
Thank you, Ms. Amanda Besar. Right on time. Before we go to the Q&A session, I would like to highlight a few important points from Ms. Amanda Besar presentation. Her presentation corresponds heavily to two of our speakers for today. In the beginning of her presentation, Ms. Amanda Besar complements what has been highlighted by Dr. Hastiadi about the overall Indonesian economic outlook and how we are currently in a stable position, especially with regards in responding to the potential recession coming. And then Ms. Amanda Besar also emphasized the strategic importance of the upcoming G20 meeting, which has been highlighted by Professor Hikmanto Juwana. In her presentation, Ms. Besar also elaborate further on the 4 pillars of the G20 meeting, as well as explaining more about the strategy, the deliverables, and how, even though that this forum won't be a forum that will produce any legally binding instruments, but hopefully will set the tone, the commitment for these big countries. So we are now entering our, thank you very much, Ms. Amanda Besar, for such a clear presentation. We are now entering our discussion and Q&A session. And as I've mentioned before, I would like to provide the opportunity for all participants to, if you'd like to ask directly, you may raise your hand and I can give you the opportunity. You might ask either one of our 3 remaining participants in the Zoom meeting, or you may also provide your question by writing in the chat room. Any questions so far? So while we're waiting for participants, I would like probably to ask Ms. Amanda Besar a little bit about the one of the 3 pillars is energy transition, and how we should have the national strategy aligned with our commitment, especially when it comes to climate change, But how do you think that the fact that now that our energy consumption is still pretty much heavily reliant on fossil fuels aligns with that vision, with that sustainability initiatives and goals, Ms. Amanda Besar?
Thank you for the question. Actually, this is one of the points that are most heavily debated within the session, because I think that there is a difference in which countries are at this stage of using fossil fuels. I think that for Indonesia, we have taken this into account. We have such a huge range of energy sources that we can use for renewable energy. I think, there's like hydrogen, water, wind, solar. We just have so many options. But now our challenge is investing in it. Like, how do we attract investors and so that we can use these and not continue to be reliant on the previous energy resources that we've already had. I mean, we have a long-term strategy for this, but I think that especially with the way that the world is right now, with our need to continue to use the fossil fuels because of the war and all of the other exacerbating factors, it might be quite some time before we are able to completely phase out from that. Having said that, the G20 actually for many years has this commitment in order to phase out usage of fossil fuels. So it's definitely within the future, but I think that there are still a lot of challenges ahead.
Thank you. Professor Hikmahanto, so what do you expect to see from the upcoming G20 meeting? Of course, we all know, hopefully, the prominent leaders will be there. The big names that are currently in the hotspot at the moment will be there, like Russia. But what do you specifically expect to see and happen in order to promote the idea that this forum can actually bring so many benefits, advantages, especially with regards to economic recovery?
Well, it's not only the big names, but the issue is those who are responsible in making decisions within their countries. This is very important because if they will send a representative of this head of delegation or head of governments, then the problem that the global or the world is facing is not going to be solved. I understand that the leaders will try to use Indonesia as a means to negate other head of government or head of state. For example, the US will say that, if if Russia will come, then they will not come. Or previously, Australia did the same, or the Canadian Prime Minister have said so. This is not responsible. This is irresponsible from the leaders of countries that is involved in the G20. What Indonesia is begging is for them to come, and of course, they will address the agenda that is being set previously. But the more important thing is the side meeting within that conference, so that they will discuss among each other. Remember, as I mentioned, during the Bretton Woods, it is much more easier, and it is because those who won the war decided to talk the global challenges. Japan, Germany, for example, or Italy, they were not invited. But now, because the war is still occurring, is still happening, and we understand that it is between Russia, and against Ukraine, and of course backed by NATO, by the United States, So they have to come. They have to come. If you go to Security Council, for example, it's going to be meaningless because the 5 countries which are involved now, they are taking side. And for example, when the US having a resolution condemning the Russian attack against Ukraine, for example, it is being vetoed. It is being vetoed by Russia. Yeah, and China. If you look at the behavior of China, when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, he, as I mentioned, met with President Putin, as if sending a message that, look, I'm going to take side with Russia. So how are we going to resolve the problem? How are we going to resolve the issue? I mean, within the United Nations, because it is formal, probably it's difficult. So what I'm suggesting is those leaders, if they are responsible leaders, and making sure that the world will not enter into any crisis in the future, they have to come. They have to come to Indonesia. They have to come to Bali, and then they will discuss the issue in Bali.
Thank you, Prof. Hikmahanto. So considering your time constraint, I would like to pose to you another question that has been raised in the chat room by Alia Zafira, our Master of Ceremony. So Prof. Hikmahanto, as we know that the government use tax expenditures to boost investment, innovation, and employment. However, these schemes are largely opaque, costly, and often ineffective in reaching the stated goals. What do you think G20 members should do in order to improve the performance of these tools?
This is a good question, which I'm afraid I'm not an expert. This has to be addressed to colleague Pak Hastiadi, Dr. Hastiadi, since he's an economist. This is an issue of economy that I'm afraid if I'm going to answer this question, then I will look, be foolish. So I have to pass this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hikmahanto. I would like to move on to a question raised in the chat room for Professor Andrew Mitchell. Professor Andrew Mitchell, so the TRIPS waiver often closely ties to North-South tension in terms of IP protection. This is because arguably IP as commodities is heavily owned by the global North. In this context, will there a risk of IP retaliation by countries in disagreement with TRIPS waiver? How the condition affects international trade and TRIPS waiver discussion as a whole? And this question is posed by Mr. Angga Priyanca. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much for the question. Yeah. I mean, because the waiver was agreed by consensus by all WTO members, I think that that means there isn't a large risk of retaliation in the WTO context in relation to the waiver. But what my research has indicated is that the waiver was often presented by a number of countries and NGOs as a simple solution to their problems. If we suddenly had a TRIPS waiver, then it would mean that there would be equitable access to vaccines. But the article has shown that the situation is actually much more complicated than that. I think the TRIPS waiver that we have has been agreed is probably useful, and it does simplify and address some of the criticisms that were levied at the previous waiver. But it's also important that countries are aware of the different flexibilities that are already contained in the TRIPS agreement. A number of jurisdictions in their own domestic intellectual property law don't avail themselves of those flexibilities that are open to them under the TRIPS agreement. And I think that this sometimes is a misunderstanding of the international legal position that leads certain countries to think, oh, well, we must waive IP rights, when it might just be a question in some cases of using existing flexibilities properly. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor. And then thank you. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, Angga. And next one is from Fadia Isna to Miss Amanda. Will Indonesia utilize the informal diplomacy into the G20 as normally conducted in ASEAN? How the formal agendas make rooms for informal diplomacy? If yes, what would be the main issues that Indonesia would try to push forward in the formal meetings in the G20?
Okay, thank you for this question. So I think there's probably two approaches that I can use for this particular question. So the first is the way that we've conducted informal dialogue, and then the second is what exactly within those informal dialogues that we've pushed so far. Now, in terms of form, the Sherpa in our meetings have tried to have these discussions occur in a more like relaxed setting. So in our second Sherpa meeting that was in Labuan Bajo, we actually had the heads of delegates, the G20 members, congregate in a ship that we brought like around the Labuan Bajo area. And within that, there were informal dialogues, just conversations between the delegates on the things that we are going to be discussing in the formal meetings. So in form, that's the way that we've attempted to provide this avenue for informal dialogue. And second, even within the formal dialogues, we also have had many like informal conversations. That's where we have bilateral meetings that has been ongoing throughout the entire G20 process. As for what Indonesia will try to push for, mostly I think these two issues of food and energy. Health, of course, is also very important, but I think in recent times, because of the conflict, food and energy has been the most important issues as it affects the cost of living. It affects the people much more deeply now, even though we are also focusing on the health issue. Now, for the food and energy issues, one of the things that we are trying to get delegates to agree to is what will we do about the food production and supply and availability of food. This is, I think we all know about the Black Sea deal that was done at the initiative of Turkey and the UN. And so I think we are hoping that perhaps there might be some sort of further action to be done in relation to this deal. As the deal, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the expiry will be somewhere in November for the extension of this deal. So I think that's kind of in the forefront of our minds right now, as well as, of course, the energy issues that are affecting everyone worldwide.
Thank you. All participants, we still have a little bit of time for more questions. You're still welcome to raise your questions by raising your hand, or you can also write your questions in the chat room, and I will read it for you. So, Professor Andrew Mitchell, I would like to ask your opinion on to what extent that the current framework on waiver will be able to maybe respond to future, extraordinary circumstances as we have encountered in the last 2 years. Do you think this can serve as a solid framework, or do you think it will need revisiting in order to respond to all the potential issues that you have highlighted in your presentation?
Thanks. I think it will be can be useful in relation to future pandemics as well. But intellectual property is not the only issue in relation to access to vaccines. And what we also need to look at is other dimensions of the problem as well, including the approach of different national regulatory authorities or NRAs. So during the pandemic, it was quite clear that a lot of legacy approaches to vaccine approvals wouldn't be sufficient. And there was a new the crisis that COVID-19 brought about instilled a new sense of the value of different networking, work sharing, and recognition amongst different regulatory authorities in all countries and regions. And this sort of regional and multilateral collaboration, particularly in Asia Pacific, enabled more knowledge and resources to be shared and contributed to some degree of harmonization in rules and procedures. And I think that is just as useful as the TRIPS waiver in paving the way for dealing with future transnational health crises. And so the important thing is that we take stock of what lessons were learnt during the pandemic, and catalog those learnings and make sure that we use them to make sure that we're better prepared for future challenges.
Thank you, Professor Andrew. We're still waiting. Is there any more questions? We still have around 10 to 15 minutes. Any more questions? All right. I think if there are no more questions, let me check. Should we wrap it up, committees? Okay. Before we end our session, I would like to provide maybe a minute or two for each of our speakers to provide a closing statement, to conclude our discussion for today. I would like to give the first opportunity to Professor Hikmahanto Juwana.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. As I mentioned, the current situation is a challenge for all of us in the world, the international community. I'm not going to compare with what is happening during 1944, the Bretton Woods, but I think it is time for the world to be together, as the theme of Indonesia's presidency, which is recover together, has to be emphasized. If countries acting like a child, trying to only pinpoint that you are wrong, then we're not going to move forward. So I think it is appropriate for Indonesia to have the theme, even though at that time we have never conceived that a war is going to happen. But now recover together is very important. And then, of course, we want recover stronger. This is the theme that Indonesia is taking. And I hope the Indonesian government is going to facilitate. This is a historic moment for Indonesia to make sure that the world leaders come to Indonesia, to Bali, and then Indonesia will facilitate discussion among them to see what is the prospect for peace in Ukraine, and also how we are going to move forward with world's economy. So that's my statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hikmahanto Juwana. Next, I would like to give the opportunity for Professor Andrew Mitchell to give a concluding remark.
Well, thanks very much. I guess I'll just go over the main contention of my presentation, which is although a TRIPS waiver can help to break down some of the IP-related barriers to vaccine distribution, particularly when it comes to patents and copyrights, it certainly isn't the only piece of the puzzle. And when it comes to implementing a TRIPS waiver, although a waiver might cause some theoretical conflicts of laws issues, for instance, when it comes down to non-WTO trade and investment treaties that member states might be part of, these issues are not really likely to cause problems in practice, given the exceptional state of affairs in the world right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Next, I would like to give the opportunity to Ms. Amanda Besar.
Thank you. I think I would like to just, first of all, maybe give a note of appreciation for the committee, as well as to say that Indonesia is currently at a very interesting place in international diplomacy. We are the presidency for the G20. Next year, we will be chairing ASEAN, and we have also been selected to be part of the steering committee for the UN Global Crisis Response Group on food, energy, and finance. So we're actually in this incredible position of making a difference in the way that we conduct global economic recovery in the future. We have the G20, which is, such an international level, such a premier economic forum. We have ASEAN, which is to strengthen the regional strength for this region. And then we have the UNGCRG. So I think that, for everyone here, it is such an incredible time to, be seeing how you can take part in all of these different processes that Indonesia is currently undergoing, and seeing, for example, how we can make this all a success in a collaborative manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we can conclude the importance of the strengthening of international legal framework to promote economic recovery. And if we relate to the discussion of Professor Andrew Mitchell with regards to TRIPS waiver, we can see that how it can promote economic recovery. And then from the presentation of Ms. Amanda Besar and Prof. Hikmahanto Juwana, we can see the strategic opportunity and how the upcoming G20 meeting can be the media in order to promote and support the recovery that we are expecting to happen. And I would like to again thank all the presenters for your time today, to Professor Hikmahanto Juwana, to Professor Andrew Mitchell, to Ms. Amanda Besar, as well as Dr. Hastiadi for your time today. I hope we can all meet again in future events. In that case, that would be the end of our first plenary session, and I'll give back the floor to our Master of Ceremony. Alia, back to you. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Detania Sukarja, for kindly moderating our first plenary session. Before we wrap up our session today, we would like to inform all of the attendees to take a break for lunch and prayer until 13:30 Western Indonesia time, and followed by parallel session right afterwards. For the parallel session, it will be shared in some rooms. Please see your panel assignment to know about session location. It's been a pleasure for me to host this amazing event today. I, Alia Zafira, as the Master of Ceremony, signing off. Thank you, and I wish you all a pleasant day.